Shalom. Each year I try and give an update about what's new in learning about the horrible Holocaust from the 50s. So in 2011, I want to talk first about the Eichmann trial. It's 50 years ago since Israel captured Eichmann, who was the architect of a lot of the mass murder of the Jews, millions of Jews, and brought him to Israel for trial. And that revolutionized Israeli thinking about the Holocaust, because until then, 50 years ago, people didn't talk about it. It was almost like it was a shame. The Israelis were embarrassed, if you can imagine that. The survivors were embarrassed because a lot of the feeling was, well, why didn't you fight back? And the survivors would say, well, why didn't you help us more? But the government said to the survivors, we need your testimony. And they started unraveling the stories. And that led to a revolution not only in Israel, but all over the world, the United States and elsewhere, and people beginning to talk about the Holocaust. Until then, there were virtually no Holocaust museums, and now they're springing up in many places. Of course, the key ones are Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. is part of the Smithsonian, and I live in the Chicago area. We have a new significant Holocaust Museum and Educational Center in Skokie, all products of that Eichmann trial and the revolution that occurred in Israel. It was a turning point for the young nation. And the glass booth in which Eichmann stood during the trial is even preserved in the Israeli Museum. So how did it help Israel confront this dark past? Well, it was almost taboo in Israel before the Eichmann trial. But at that time, a quarter of the Israelis, if you can imagine that, were Holocaust survivors. And there was a lot of guilt and shame on both sides, as I said, so they didn't want to talk about it. But when they were told that they needed the evidence, they began talking about it. And David Ben-Gurion talks about how the Holocaust brought the new generation closer because they knew nothing about it. And the attitude that became predominant was the notion that we're a sovereign country, and we have a right to judge a citizen, a criminal who hurts our citizens. And so they had the right to kidnap Eichmann and bring him to Israel for trial. Israel may not represent the entire Jewish people, but it does represent the 6 million victims, and so it was a perfectly appropriate place to try him. And it formulated Israel's official attitude about the Holocaust, which is still relevant today. And one of the significant ideas that came out of that is that the survival of the state of Israel is the only response to the persecution of Jews. Now, that was one of the ideological underpinnings in Zionism originally. If you go back and think about the major people that were proponents of Zionism, like Theodor Herzl, as a result of the historic anti-Semitism. But the Eichmann trial concretized it and solidified it in a whole new way, bringing to the attention of the new Israeli generation the significant dynamic and need for Jewish power. So what are the lessons? Well, there are several lessons, and there's a brand new book which is quite controversial by Tom Segev, an Israeli, called the Seventh Million. And he makes a couple of points. So the first point, of course, is that Israel must be strong, that in many ways the Arabs are the new Nazis, and Israel Israel has to do what it has to do to protect itself. But the other piece that Segev talks about in his book is the whole notion that Jews were deprived of their rights, and the Jewish state has to make sure that it balances the need for security against the need for rights. And America is going through the same issue now as we combat terrorism. But at this time, at this moment in history, in 2011, we think back 50 years to 1961 and the dramatic kidnapping of Eichmann, who, next to Hitler, was responsible for the death of more Jews than anybody else in human history, and who had a cavalier attitude about it at the trial. I'll laugh into my grave because I killed so many Jews. The Jewish people, the state of Israel, executed him. He's the only person ever executed in the state of Israel. And now Israeli law has the right to execute terrorists, but they haven't done so. But Eichmann was the one that was executed because of his brutal genocide. A very significant turning point in the history of Jewish thought about the Holocaust and the way it's treated, and our understanding about the need for a very strong and vital state of Israel. Shalom.